Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, presented to you by the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of the Combined Arms Center, U.S. Army, or U.S. government.
Hello, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Nikki Dean, and today we're digging into the Wayback Files for a little history, theory, and doctrine about a concept associated by that most contentious of wide-brim hats, the Cavalry Squadron. Our topic today is cavalry operations above the brigade. With me today are three fellow cavalry enthusiasts. We're joined today by the Maneuver Center of Excellence Commanding General, Major General Patrick Donahoe. We're also joined by Major Nathan Jennings, who's a history instructor with the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College here at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. We're also joined by Colonel Retired Mr. Rich Creed, the Director of the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate, CADD. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nikki.
Hey, Nikki, I think it's really important at this point in this to remind everybody that Rich Creed is a national treasure.
Sir, I can't believe you got that in so quick. You're a true cavalryman.
I think it's necessary to lay some groundwork on cavalry as a formation and the evolutions of our missions. Looking back, or looking at the more modern history, I'd say, about the past 50 years of CAV, probably will give our listeners a little bit more historical perspective. And it's not that I don't think CAV hasn't always existed in some form or fashion. And it meant to provide the commander the ability to see the battlefield ahead of the battle. But I think we probably need to snap a chalk line somewhere in our published history. And the reason why is if we don't give ourselves a more modern start in the discussion today, we're going to find ourselves wandering so far back in time that I would be burned at the stake for wearing trousers as a woman. So if you don't mind, I'm going to start us out probably looking back at about the last 50 years or so. Looking back about 50 years to the post-Vietnam era, it seems like that is the makings of what our modern cavalry formations really look like. So starting there, Mr. Creed, would you, as the man with the field manuals, give us a little background on the doctrine and the definitions of cavalry missions as they evolved and what they are today?
Yeah, sure, Nikki. So we'll talk about cavalry and maybe some of the things that give it the qualities to be able to perform the types of missions that the Army expects it to do. But cavalry was defined as a combat maneuver force of combined arms mounted in ground or aerial vehicles. And the mounted in vehicles piece is important when we think about having the mobility capability that's equal to or greater than the opposition, right? So that's important to enabling the qualities that we need to be able to execute cavalry missions. So we say it was uniquely organized, equipped, and trained to find the enemy in order to prevent the friendly main body from being engaged under adverse circumstances, or what we'd say now at positions of relative disadvantage, and then to provide within capability security for the main body. So there's two essential criteria, or what we would call mission sets maybe for cavalry formations. The first is to find the enemy and develop the situation with the least force possible. And we say the least force possible, it means we want to make contact and determine what's going on in a particular situation without becoming decisively engaged and losing the initiative. And then the other mission sets associated with providing reaction team and maneuver space for the main body of the friendly force. Both these criteria kind of fit into the principle of wars we associate with security. Or economy of force, either one. Sometimes those work out together. We had different historical roles for cavalry formations, and as the doctrines changed over the decades, there's 5 or 6 that remain with us today. The first is conducting reconnaissance operations to ascertain enemy weaknesses and strengths. Another is conducting security to provide early warning and maneuver space. Again, making sure friendly forces aren't leading with our face. Right, we engage the enemy on our terms, or the most favorable terms that we can figure out. We use them to cover retreats, or what the Army talks in terms of doctrine now, retrograde operations. They conduct counter reconnaissance against like formations that the enemy might field. So you can call it countering enemy cavalry. We talk about in terms of counter reconnaissance because it involves more than just engaging enemy formations. We can use cavalry as a means for a counterattack because its mobility and firepower particularly in terms of formations the Army used to have, and that the Army still does at the brigade level. They have the combat power to be able to be employed for counterattacks. And then we talk about this idea of administering the decisive blow through either isolating enemy forces during a fluid operations or pursuit of enemy formations that have largely been defeated up that point, but we pursue them to exploit that initial military success and end up defeating them in detail. So we had these combined arms organizations in every maneuver formation from brigade to corps at some point, but they varied in size, right? So for much of our careers, General Donahoe and I, the cavalry formations in a brigade or a brigade combat team, we would call it now, were the scout platoons within the maneuver battalions. And then we experimented with the brigade reconnaissance troop for a few years and never really got that to work for a lot of different reasons, maybe we can talk about later. But the focus was those cavalry squadrons at the division level and the cavalry regiments that were corps units. They had two traditional roles. The first was reconnaissance, the other was security. While we define those words separately, we tend to use the two words together, reconnaissance and security. And those definitions have evolved over time, but while they've gotten longer, as for whatever reason we tend to make our doctrinal definitions larger and our lists of qualities and characteristics longer every time we write something, they really haven't changed. They just get more specific. So when we talk about reconnaissance, we say it's a mission undertaken to obtain by either visual observation or other means, because we live in this multi-domain world, so there's other means other than your eyeballs or your weapon sights to locate and then make assessments about enemy formations. And we also, not just the enemy, but we look at terrain, right? So we want to look at trafficability, what the choke points are, where are we going to execute defile drills, again, to make sure that the main body is not surprised, that they know what they're moving towards and going to move through. And reconnaissance is a planned thing. It's not, it should never be haphazard, so it's a planned part or phase of any operation. It's continuous, and we don't like to ever leave reconnaissance capabilities in reserve either. When we talk about, and we'll get back and we'll talk about fundamentals and some of these things, I think, when General Donahoe and Major Jennings talk. So I'll just talk about the other big bin that we classify in terms of reconnaissance security. That's security. So when we define security as operations undertaken by a commander to provide early and accurate warning of enemy operations, to provide the force being protected with time and maneuver space within which to react to the enemy, and then develop the situation to allow the commander to effectively employ the protected force. So what does that mean? Well, it means there's a little bit of a tension between, am I oriented on the enemy or am I oriented on friendly forces, right? And there's always got to be a little bit, it's never an either or. There's reasons why you have to understand both. And so I think I would leave it at there. Otherwise, we're just going to talk about definitions all for the rest of the hour. So
We could talk about doctrine all the time.
yeah.
So I guess we've often kind of associated the cavalry, the traditional roles of cavalry and the missions that they perform with really specific echelons and capabilities. And Nate, I know you've done quite a bit of research into the evolutions of both the structure and the mission sets. Can you give us a little bit of historical insight as to what drove the composition of some of these combined arms formations as they were in that post-Vietnam but pre-GWAT era, and what that means overall and what that has done for us now?
Yeah, sure, I can. So this is really about the Warsaw Pact. The U.S. Army recognized their problem in Europe was they had to fight for space and time against a larger force that was a peer force with Tier 1 tech. And so that required these divisions over there, so we can use 1ID as a good example. It's there with, I forget, is it 7th Corps in Germany at the time? They have this problem that the Soviet horde is coming through the Fulda, through other gaps, and they have to hold them off. And so now you need an independent cavalry formation out front to do that fighting, and then divisions need their own Div Cav or Division Cavalry Squadron to shape kind of their fight ahead of them. We might call it the near deep fight. And so that leads the Army of Excellence reforms, where they continue some modifications from road, kind of the 1960s, where they started to form these larger cavalry organizations. But it drives the development of echeloned RNS. And more importantly, they're air-ground teams that can fight. They can fight for information, they can defend, they're durable, they're survivable in a way that previous mounted organizations had not been, in the way we don't have now, by the way. And so as, the real importance here is, as we're looking at a contemporary LISCO fight, it's a similar battlefield framework, arguably, and we now have that capabilities gap to do a similar kind of function.
You had a scale and scope thing there too, right? So you had 2 corps in Europe, and you're talking about troop lists in the hundreds of thousands, right? In a relatively small area. And so that context, I think, is a huge part of what we're trying to do. I mean, arguably you're talking about World War II size formations with modern technology or modern at the time, right? And so you had some luxuries in terms of force structure based upon a true operational need in a political context that I think set some conditions for the development of things that maybe we have more of a challenge now, showing people that we have a need for those kinds of things.
Yeah, Rich, what I find fascinating about the era that Nate's talking about is, first off, you were in the Army and had dark hair at that point, right? So,
yeah, that's right.
But you saw this constant change of, were we going to be able to really fight for information, or were we going to be more stealthful in how we gain information, right? And so, the ACRs, right? So the second ACR kind of focused on the Ton pocket on the Czech border, right? And you had the 11th in Fulda, and those were really capable organizations, right? The regimental cavalry troop at that point, 2 Bradley scout platoons, 6 and 6, 2 tank platoons supporting those, zone mortars, zone TOC, zone maintenance and recovery. 13 Bradleys, 9 tanks plus mounted mortars, 3 troops abreast, and then on the regimental side, then it had its own Paladin battery or 109 battery with it, right? And then you had, in the regimental structure, then you had the aviation squadron. That organization could fight, right? I mean, that was designed to truly cover, separated from the main body, complete independent operations to allow, the Corps commander the time and space to organize behind it. If you remember the divisional cavalry squadrons at the time, late 80s, only Bradley, right? So we go to fight a lesser threat, right? We go to take on the Great Patriotic War, Desert Storm, and what do we do in the desert? We take all of our divisional cavalry squadrons and change them to the regimental design, minus the 109 battery, but you had your own 2 air troops plus the AVM troop, right? So again, an 05 level commanded organization, 3 ground cav troops as described, 2 air troops of various ages of helicopters, right? Cobra, OH-58, then OH-58 Delta armed, and then Kiowa Warrior, right? As we mature that formation, but that ability to fight, and then this ongoing debate of fight or stealth still continues today, right? And so that's when you look at the evolution of that in the kind of the 1980s, 90s, I think is really dramatic for our Army.
So the other thing that, and we, from a doctrinal standpoint, kind of talk about this strategic set as a context for what we emphasize is important. But so, regardless of how the battles might have been conducted, I mean, they were never conducted, so we don't know, but you're still conducting the defense. And so those robust cavalry organizations were buying time for our brigade to get out of the motor pool and get to our hide positions where we could prepare for a counterattack along the movement corridors. And so those guys in those cavalry outfits, whether it was the division cavalry or the ACRs, were trying to buy us 24, 48 hours to get set, while all this other bad stuff's coming down and happening around you. And yet those organizations, when they're actually employed, were not employed for offensive or defensive operations. They were found to be extremely effective in offensive operations. And I think our Army right now, we don't plan on fighting any large-scale defenses anywhere, right? The strategic context is, if we have to fight LSCO, we probably are going to shade towards offensive operations, which kind of puts us in the same boat, but we don't have those capabilities to draw upon that had been trained over decades.
Yeah, what I really find interesting about all this is that, back then the debate was, does the brigade commander need his own reconnaissance and security element, right?
Right.
Because the corps commander had one.
Right.
The division commander had one.
Right.
The brigade did not, so the brigade commander would raid the scout platoons of,
Right.
the battalions, and then we would do these we'd build these counter reconnaissance organizations out of hide at the brigade level, where we piecemeal combat power out of the battalions. And today we've got this exact opposite problem. We've got this very large formation in the BCT, but our division and corps commanders have nothing. And Nate, that's your history project, right? Had we end up at that crazy ass solution, right? And it just doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, other than we went away from our belief we were going to have to fight large-scale combat operations.
Right. I think that's a decisive factor in the whole equation. Because, it was as late as 2000. 2001, we were still playing around with DivCav organizations. And, almost every year we looked at
the move to Baghdad.
Right.
3ID. That's
37 Cav.
Then Lieutenant Colonel, now Lieutenant General Terry Farrell, right?
Right.
Fights 37 Cav as, conducting his own reconnaissance, in many ways a route reconnaissance forward of the main body, and does that all the way up into the Karbala Gap, right? Just a long mission but that organization fought, right? And it was purpose built to not only fight for information, but to shape the battlefield and delay the main body commander from having to commit his main body forces. And that's exactly what Colonel Farrell does that whole time.
So that's one of the historical ironies here. 37 Cav has the most magnificent display of Div Cav doing its job in the march to Baghdad. Within 2 years, every Div Cav in the Army is liquidated.
Right.
And turned into BCTs. And it's based off a different theory of action for how to fight, right? Dispersed BCTs with more capability, faster warfare, which needs to be re-examined, right? And I think the Army's in the process of that. I guess we could associate that with Secretary Rumsfeld and his kind of approach to warfare. And you guys have done capability gap studies that have validated that this is a gap.
Yeah, the bigger picture, you fit that in. If the Army's and we've talked about this on these podcasts before, but if you say that the Army is whatever it is now, 485, 490,000 people, it's the same size as it was before the war started, or the war started in Afghanistan and Iraq, more or less, but it's a very different Army. Not just in terms of cavalry, but in all kinds of functions. And some of those other things would affect, some of those other gaps you mentioned would affect our ability to employ cavalry formations now. You couldn't just build them and not account for all the other things that would have to enable them during operations.
So I guess we're actually kind of moving pretty quickly through the history of a lot of this. And it's a rare opportunity to have somebody who sits down at the schoolhouse who is preparing and thinking about the modernization of cavalry formations and reconnaissance and security operations. To have you here, sir, how do you see this emerging, or how do you see the training of young scouts emerging down at the schoolhouse? And then also, what is the modernization plan? How are we accounting for some of these capabilities that we've lost over the past 2 decades? Me looking at it personally as a former Div Cav girl, it's a hole that we've lost.
Well, first of all, I think the Army agrees with you, right? We've lost this capability, and we need it back, especially at the division level. And so, if you look at all the warfighters over the past 3 years or so, virtually every division commander has built a reconnaissance and security element to use at the division level. They built it at a hide, just pulled it up, developed it, and then fought it. Of course, the problem is they're not optimized for the mission. They haven't trained. If they were humans instead of electrons, right? They wouldn't have trained for the mission, right? They're manned mostly by 11 series and 19 kilos, not 19 deltas. And so we've built these organizations, and then you try to incorporate aviation with it. It makes it even harder, right? And so these are the habitual relationships that the humanity of it is critical, right? So the relationships of the soldiers on the ground, training the mission set, understanding the mission set, growing up in that mission set, and then being able to fight those missions. You can't just put that together on the fly. And I think as an Army, we've realized that. So we've already put the force design update in for the reestablishment of the Divisional Cavalry Squadron. It'll have landing spots in it for the updated technologies that we can spiral into those formations. All of the semi-autonomous robotic systems that we know we're going to want to have, right? And so, not to get to the prior, the series of firsts that we have with the Striker Brigade, but we intend to make first contact unmanned, right? That's what we want to do. So you need to have those unmanned formations inside your reconnaissance and security elements, and so we're going to have space for that. Now that'll be that's a good size organization for the division commander. It will not have organic aviation, but we will have habitual relationships with the Armed Reconnaissance Squadron in the Combined Arms or the Combat Aviation Brigade. Dave Francis and I, matter of fact, we just talked about that this morning, right? But how we've got to get after that element. There is no appetite Army-wide to build the air-ground teams that we had prior to 2004 or 5 when we disbanded the Divisional Cavalry. I think in a perfect world we'd put them back together. It is just a very, very difficult cultural thing now to rebuild those organizations. But what we'll lose through that, and for the fact that we don't have simpler airframes anymore. But I can remember being at Hohenfels as the Alpha Troop Commander of 1-1 Cav, the 1st Armored Division's Divisional Cavalry, and having Jimmy Blackman, who was the Desperado Troop Commander, land right near my tank, and both he and I talking on the ground about how the fight was developing. Right, 2 young punk captains, kind of doing that because we had that personal relationship and we had that understanding of how the fight was going to go. So that's on a relationship piece that I think we need to get back to, and so the habitual relationship will have to be deep, and we'll have to train to it. But then at the brigade level, so then you're saying, okay, well, where are you going to get that all that extra combat power from? Well, we're going to go in and we're going to change the reconnaissance and security element inside the BCT, and so we're looking at taking what is currently the BCT's Cav squadrons and moving those to a Cav troop. Now, this is not your uncle's BRT, right? This is not going back to what was a reconnaissance, surveillance, target acquisition capability for the brigade commander. This will be a like-built, divisional Cav troop resident inside the BCT. So the most combat-capable organization inside the BCT will be that brigade cavalry troop. And again, it's a landing spot for where we can spiral in some of the technologies. And we'll have to experiment with that over time to make sure we get that organization right, because we don't know if that's the right organization. Do you have robotic wingmen inside the platoons, or do you build a separate platoon for robots and then operate it? And we're going to learn that because we're hoping to pilot this starting this summer on the heavy side. And then we're looking at the same thing. We look at our light brigades. First off, we're really looking deeply at the IBCT as a viable structure. The challenge with the IBCT is it's got almost as much rolling stock as an ABCT. So it's not this, it's not 7th ID 1985 where they can get on a small number of aircraft and fly somewhere and be a presence on the ground and complex terrain and be effective. It's not a strategically nimble outfit. So we're looking at how do we, and by the way, the only organizations in the IBCT that walk to work, the rifle companies. Everybody else has a ride, right? Like the assistant S2's got his own Humvee, right? Well, make that gal walk, right? I mean, we gotta figure that out. But so we're looking at how do you fully motorize, and then how do you get back to a really light organization, and then same deal. How do we use those structures to reconstitute divisional cavalry, divisional reconnaissance capability at the division level, while you still maintain a reconnaissance capability inside the BCT. Right, that will be, we're looking at an 11 series reconnaissance company inside the BCT as we move forward. We're still playing with that design, but again, we viscerally feel the lack of the reconnaissance and security element at the division level, and we're moving forward to fix it.
So I think this is probably going to take some time, really, to get fully integrated into the Army and into the force structure. And the question becomes, if you're in this position now and you're on a division staff or you're in a corps staff and you're looking at how do I prepare myself for the next warfighter that's going to kick me in the teeth, what are some things that we're starting to see organizations doing to bridge the gap, and what kind of mitigations are they putting in place to be able to get them through the time period until we can bring, thank God, we can bring DivCav back?
Well, I mean, I was here when I first got here to Fortress Leavenworth. I think it was the Big Red One, just down the highway, was preparing to do a warfighter. And the division commander at the time took it upon himself to reconstitute a DivCav-like formation. So they task organized one of the cavalry squadrons from the BCTs. They gave it engineers, artillery, tried to establish some, during training at home station, some habitual relationships with the aviation and sustainment community, because again, our sustainment was modular at the time and pretty thin on the ground, and yet I needed to have this formation that could fight out in front. How do I address things, and who fights that organization? Is it a BCT because they're in front of the BCT, or is the division staff fighting? If the division staff's fighting it, who on the division staff's fighting it? And who exactly are they working for? Who's giving them their marching orders? So the CG there was wrestling with that and had enjoyed some success in that warfighter. I want to say it was in 2016, early 2017. And what was interesting was that he actually ran into some pushback from some folks that, in terms of what are you doing to the this modular force? That's not how we were designed to fight. Who said it was okay to do that? And because this is a warfighter, not an experiment. It's not a war game for you to do those kinds of things. Now, we're long past that culturally, because I think every warfighter since then, folks have been doing that. And I think it was more pushback about, you didn't tell me you were doing that ahead of time, than anything else. But we had changed our scenarios, and so the scenarios were different. They were LISCO scenarios. So I'll let both Nate and General Donahoe talk about the specifics, but I mean, a lot of the things that they had to do out of hide to task organize from a doctrinal standpoint, it was more than just figuring out what was going to fit into it. How do you build that team before you show up for the training event or the combat operation?
Yeah, I go back to my comment I made earlier, right? I mean, it's easier to move the electrons around for a warfighter than it is to actually build the organization and fight the organization.
Absolutely.
Right, and then to have staffs at echelon who understand how to employ it, how to resource it. I had a great discussion with Major General Rodney Fogg at CASCOM right before Lee about how we're going to sustain divisional cavalry, right? Because he's concerned about that, right? Because that's a different way of operating for our logisticians, right? Who has the responsibility to sustain the divisional cavalry squadron in a guard mission, right, across the frontage of the division, right? And it's a different way of operating than we've operated in 20 years, and so
risk is very different.
Absolutely, right? And so we're going to have to look across the whole piece, because this also goes back, right, to this whole discussion of divarity, right?
Right.
We established divarties 5 years ago now, but they're unencumbered. And so if you go back to the division as the unit of action, then you give the capabilities required to fight the division to the division commander. You provide that division commander a cavalry squadron. Do you now re-encumber the divarity, meaning do you take the artillery out of the BCTs? And so one of our fundamentals of reconnaissance is you don't leave reconnaissance in reserve. One of the fundamentals of artillery, you don't leave artillery in reserve. Right now, if you employ the division 2 up and 1 back, unless you make a conscious decision to pull that artillery battalion out of its organic BCT, you're by definition leaving a third of your artillery in reserve. So we're violating our own principles by the way we're organized. Worked well in wide area security. Does not work in large-scale combat operations.
Yeah, you're reminding me, sir. I showed my students at CGSC an org chart of 7th Corps in the Gulf War. 4 artillery brigades, an ACR, and a Div Cav for every 4 mechanized or armored divisions. And so it's that ability to pool artillery and then mass fires ahead of these recon guys who need it to do their job. And you can trace that back to World War II, where that was the real Army specialty, was pooling artillery at the Corps and even Field Army level.
Well, we don't keep intel in reserve either, right? So there's 3 things we don't keep in reserve. And while cavalry formations are not intelligence organizations, they're certainly collecting information that intelligence professionals turn into actionable either combat information or intelligence. And that's when people get into the whole discussion about where does it fit in a warfighting function? Well, cavalry's movement and maneuver. Well, okay. But their mission sets are about enabling situational awareness and then friendly decision making. And so you could make the same argument about the BCT RNS or cavalry squadrons. If you're 2 up, 1 back, then one of those is in reserve as well. And that's not really helping the division commander much.
Sir, I just want to add, I really liked what you said about first contact with the unmanned systems, because as we talk about Div Cav, I think we're all reaching back conceptually to the 80s and 90s, the late Cold War Div Cavs. But we have to remember the context.
We call that the golden age.
The golden age, okay. We have to remember they were doctrinally designed to fight behind the ACR, right? They're not the first. They can be, but they weren't really designed to be the first contact element. And you could argue whether they had the ability to handle that burden, which is why the Army, the planners there, realized, okay, we need a full ACR as the first contact force. And so that's what I was going to ask. How are we mitigating this then? If we just have a ground Cav squadron that may now be the lead kind of into the enemy disruption area or something like that, doing the full weight of the counter recon fight, and that's perfect. That's a way to kind of expand its capability.
Yeah, and I think there's this really rich discussion, and to be honest with you, I'm not sure what side of the discussion I'm on yet. That the reason you don't need the armored cavalry regiment for the Corps commander is because you have this, explosion of unmanned systems, mainly aerial, but you have this very, very robust, UAS capability now, not only in the United States Army but in the Air Force, and we have space-based assets, right, that can help us see forward the Corps. And can you use all the UAS capability you've got and tied back to fires, both Air Force fires and our own? Can you use that then to shape the enemy, either in the offense or the defense, forward of the division, forward of your lead divisions, right? And then your divisional cavalry squadron, and then become that first element that's going to make kind of ground-on-ground contact. I still think in the ground-on-ground contact, you want that first contact to be unmanned, and you want that to be unmanned ground systems, right? And I think we want to see those ground cavalry troops to have both unmanned air systems and unmanned ground systems inside them, so that they can expand what they can see and what they can do. My concern with this, though, is when you look at the capabilities of our UASs. First off, they're very, very technical in nature, and they're also very narrow in view. And so what a manned pilot, what a manned system on the ground gives you is the broader view, the context, the wide angle view of the world, where even our latest unmanned assets that we get are still very narrow in view. And so to be able to give the context of what is occurring forward of you is challenged. But it's also only the task of it's that task of surveillance rather than reconnaissance, right? What reconnaissance gives you is not only the surveillance aspect of it, but when we make contact, we can determine the will of the enemy, right? We can determine more about the enemy and their willingness to fight, their intentions, more than you can ever do with an air-based, air-breathing, or space-based surveillance asset. And that's what I think we lose by not having the formation capable of doing that.
Well, I think you lose security too. So if you want to make an argument, someone wants to have a theological argument that I can do surveillance aggressively enough that it equates to some level of reconnaissance, okay. I'm not going to get bogged down in that conversation, but what you're saying is your security is entirely based upon the employment of joint capabilities at that point, or Army fires. But it's your security coming depending almost entirely upon indirect fires or joint fires of some flavor, as opposed to something that the commander on the ground actually controls in terms of direct fire capabilities.
Hey, Rich, just to kind of pull that thread a little, because I think there's also this other problem in our Army today, and you hear it in every discussion, where very, very quickly we will devolve into a discussion of warfare as a targeting exercise.
Exactly.
And that is, first of all, it's wrong, right? Warfare is much broader than just analyzing a target list and applying fires against that target list. And that's why we need organizations to fight on the ground to determine what the enemy is willing and capable of doing, much more so than just, hey, I'm going to take out these 6 targets and then the will of the enemy will collapse and we'll be off and running to victory.
Well, and so we grew up in an Army where if your commander asks, is the success of your course of action based on the availability of air power, right, or joint capabilities? And if your answer was yes, then they told you that's not a good plan, because those are not all weather. There's environmental things or different priorities somewhere other than where you happen to be operating on the ground that may make those unavailable right when you need them the most. I would tell you that my perception is Army senior leaders like yourself, but even more senior at the strategic level, they all understand this, and so it's about how much risk we're willing to accept. So the Army, hosted by 3rd Corps in the summer of 2018 at Fort Hood, had a reconnaissance and security summit. And as many of the serving division commanders as were available showed up for it. All 3 Corps commanders participated either live or virtually, as did some of the Theater Army commanders. And then a whole host of 06s, 05s, subject matter experts and RNS Cavalry type things. And they divided up into 3 working groups to figure out from each of the different Corps perspectives what should the Army do to fill this gap. And it was interesting in that each Corps, because the Corps' orientation in terms of supporting the geographical combatant commanders and the theaters that they're most likely to operate, they all came up with different solutions. But the guidance was that whatever solutions you came up to had to be resource neutral for the Army. In other words, you could not add end strength, and you can't assume that we're fielding any fancy new stuff. We'll field fancy new stuff at some point, but that's not decisive to your course of action. So with the Army you have, how would you recommend reorganizing the different capabilities? And they were wildly different in some cases. So 3 Corps came up with solutions that were very reminiscent of the Golden Age, as you talked about, because it's America's hammer. It's a heavy corps. 1st Corps had a different view because they were Indo-PACOM. They're not looking at Warsaw Pact size armored hosts banging into each other in a land-dominated theater of operations. So they had a different view. And the 18th Airborne Corps kind of had a hybrid between the two. And this is no collaboration between the groups. And so what came out of that was, okay, we're all going to agree that we're not in 100% agreement. But I think that's where the impetus for addressing the problem from a division level made more sense than trying to account for the Corps because of the resource constraints. When you just run the numbers, you can fix 18 divisions, that problem, but you're not going to be able to fix the division problem and the Corps problem. So where do we accept risk? And I think the consensus was, at least that was my read coming out of the conference, was that we're going to accept risk at the Corps level because of those national joint and essentially multi-domain capabilities could mitigate that risk down, particularly during offensive operations. I don't know what feedback you got from that kind of stuff, but at least it showed the Army was making an honest attempt at looking at the problem.
Yeah. So first off, I think this current trend of thought that the Pacific is not going to need large formations is wrong-headed.
Agreed.
I mean, watch the United States Marine Corps. Hey, we're going to divest M1 tanks. And go find any picture of the Marine Corps operating on an island in the Second World War. There's a tank in the picture, right? And so the requirement for survivable mobile protected firepower that can deliver lethality in support of infantry at close range to the enemy in a very lethal environment exists on the island of Okinawa, right? Exists on the island of Taiwan. Exists if we had to go back and retake the Philippines like we had to in 44, 45. To walk away from a discussion of fighting a peer competitor in the Pacific without large, armored brigade combat team, armored division structures is nothing short of madness. You look at how the Chinese are organizing. It's not a million guys with pitchforks. It's tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery, and they're gaining the capability. They're building naval capacity faster than Kaiser's Germany, right?
Right.
And so they want to get that capability forward to somewhere. Right. If we design a force of light infantry to go combat that threat, we're going to be sad.
Right.
So I think in kind of perfect segue, sir, of talking about how are we looking towards the future of multi-domain operations and looking at the various domains that we could be fighting in. If the maritime dominant domain of the Pacific is there and waiting for us for a potential battlefield, well, how are we getting our forces to those fights? Because we're really contained by a tyranny of distance. And that is something right now as we go through FM30 and looking at this capability that we want, but we don't necessarily have. How do we bridge that gap right now, especially as it applies to theater opening, force movement, all of those other things that get us into the fight, get our reconnaissance forces forward?
Yeah, so Nikki, first off, the Princess Bride would remind you that to fight a land war in Asia is the ultimate of stupidity, right? So I don't think we want to design our army to go fight, to liberate Shanghai, right? I mean, that's probably not what we want to do. But we may want to operate in support of another land-based ally on the mainland of Asia, right? I mean, you think Thailand. You could walk through a series of places we may want to have some capacity to support an ally or a partner. But then if you really think about the tyranny of distance and our ability to project power using naval assets, because you're not going to project significant power with air, right? I mean, you're not going to land power. You can't load up the Third Corps on C-17s, right? You just break the C-17 fleet doing it, right? And it would take you forever anyway to get it there. You might as well put them on boats and get them there. So we need a Navy that can do that, right? We need a Navy that can control the sea lanes, that can project American power, because when we think about what the Chinese are doing, they're building a Navy and an Army to project power, both on land and into the maritime domain, to seize land in the maritime domain, right? So we've got to be able to contest that. And so that's the kind of power projection we need. By the way, it's the kind of power projection we have. But the sad part is watching the Marine Corps kind of step back from the capacity to really, without Army support, be able to contest the Chinese toe for toe if they ever had to, and then to rely on one Marine I heard talking about a JLTV with a box of precision rockets on it was going to be able to turn back to some large armored formation. We know that to be a false promise. We know it. I mean, we find it out in every war. Hey, we're going to know everything about the domain. We're going to be able to precisely strike, and therefore we'll never we won't need this capacity to close with and destroy the enemy. It is old wine and new skins at every argument. And so to pray to the false god of precision strike is to sacrifice American men and women in the future. It's wrong-headed. We shouldn't do it. And so we've got to be able to then project that kind of power, and we've got to invest in it. We talk about the Pacific as a maritime domain. 7 of the largest 10 armies in the world are in the Pacific, right? There are large land masses. The archipelago of Indonesia includes the island of Java. I think the French word frickin' really big, right? I mean, these are sizable pieces of terrain, Luzon, Leyte, big pieces of ground that will consume large army forces to defend them, and we got to be ready to do that. And so, we shouldn't let other services dominate the argument of who gets to say how you're going to fight in that environment, because we've seen it. I'll tell you, if you ever want to study a great campaign, so Nate, I'll stand by for your dissertation on the Eighth Army's campaign to liberate the Philippines in 1945. Right, so January to April 45 is fascinating. Things called engineer special brigades designed to amphibiously lift entire divisions. I mean, incredible. And we don't have that capacity today. We may need to think about how we would do that. How would we fight in an archipelago with a peer threat?
So, sir, I'll see your 8th Army and raise you the U.S. 6th Army. And I've offered
Kruger, that bastard.
Mr. Creed, that this is the ultimate MDO case study. Their movement from the Papua New Guinea into the initial Philippines, and how the infantry and the armor was creating the next airfield to extend the operational reach. And you could translate directly to a ground-based missile approach now with infantry and armor, right? All the chess pieces on the board working together. And so that's the case study for MDO.
Nate, I'm with you wholeheartedly. I think, again, demonstrating why Nate is one of the 2 smartest majors currently in the Army, right? Amos Fox.
That's right.
Being a close equal, but I'd like to see them fight, the 2 of them. But no, I agree with you, right? So it's all about seizing land to shape the air and maritime domains. And then again, when you think about today, we were doing cyber type effects at the time, right? We're listening to the Japanese radio nets. We're jamming them when we want to. We're determining their disposition by watching their electromagnetic spectrum. We're using space for long range communications, right? Bouncing AM radio waves off the troposphere or stratosphere or something sphere, right? And then we're doing long range reconnaissance, which today we do that by satellites. Then we were doing it with B-24s and B-29s with cameras, right? And so it absolutely, and it was, and by the way, the whole movement into the Philippines is all designed to cut Japan off from their oil supplies and other commodities that are down in modern day Indonesia, then the Dutch East Indies, and so that's all about shaping the maritime and air domains by seizing land. Same thing we got to do, right? So MDO before MDO was cool.
When you think about the threats, so long-range precision surface-to-surface fires from the threat. What was that in the Second World War, at least in the Pacific? That's kamikazes, right? They are precision munitions flown by a brain that's acting as a computer in the pilot's seat, right? And a lot of that campaign was about removing their ability to launch those capabilities. But there's an R&S component to those fights, and as General Rainey likes to remind us, once you get on land, big landmass, small landmass, doesn't matter, it becomes a land fight. And you're not going to conduct it without the enablers, particularly the sustainment that maritime and air forces are going to provide, or the ISR that cyberspace and space provide. But we talk about going to take stuff back, but we also have obligations. We prefer not to have to take it back. It'd be nice to be able to hold what you got. Those are decisions way above a service level. But there's some thinking that probably ought to go into the ramifications of, you talked about 7 of the 10 largest armies. I think 6 of our 7 go-to-war treaty obligations are in the Pacific too, or 6 of 8, but a lot of them bilateral relationships that if you are attacked by an external aggressor, then we're going to come to your aid. That wasn't really something we had to worry about for a really long time. Nobody really thought the Soviets were going to come out of Vladivostok and invade Hokkaido or anything like that. Not really. But that's kind of changed now based on what General Donahoe already laid out. And so...
And again, I think our capability to support allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific region is one of the critical components of deterrence.
Absolutely.
And so we may not ever want or have to do it, but the capability to do it is a significant deterrent effect to bad behavior by you pick the nation of your choice.
And we still got Korea out there, by the way.
Oh, absolutely. I just left it.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we think that any fight with a peer adversary is going to be restrained to one narrow part of a joint operations area, that would be a significant error in judgment as well, I think. People will take advantage of a fight between us and one party to maybe start a fight on more favorable terms with another.
So, gentlemen, when it comes to, because I'm thinking about now, somewhere out there in the ethosphere is a young squadron commander who is either preparing an organization to go on to Pacific Pathways, or he's heading to Atlantic Resolve, or she's getting ready to rotate onto Peninsula. Those squadron commanders, what is something that they need to be thinking about as they're getting ready for some of these significant issues that they're going to face and during competition, the competition phase of operations, or the competition context of operations that we're doing now? What would be your advice to them? I
think it'd be pretty simple. They should endeavor to train their organization to be able to do a moving flank guard at night. Right. I mean, if we think the capstone of readiness at the battalion level are company team live fires at night, I think in the cavalry squadron, that's an organization that if they can get to the training level where their troop commanders fully understand what they need to do for the threefold mission, then we'll be in a good spot. Where you talk to a lot of young cavalry troop commanders today, and you say, "Hey, you're gonna be the threefold mission for the move and flank guard for the squadron." They would look at you like you have a pole growing out of your head, because they would be like, "What are you talking about?" Right? And so we've got to get back to that level of training for our cavalry formations, so that we understand the reconnaissance and security demands of large-scale combat operations in support of our higher headquarters. Right? And that's something we do not own at the visceral level right now in the Army.
Well, only a slightly less specialized, and we talked about this morning over in a course that General Donahoe and I were attending. I would throw in there, because of the nature of rotational forces and where we tend to rotate people through, I would think in terms of either as a screen or a covering for a guard mission, but conducting retrograde, some form of the retrograde defense at night in MOP 4.
Yeah, I agree.
And so when we had people that were doing that full time like you were in the 80s and 90s, that was still
What I
tough.
like about moving flank guard for a cavalry squadron, you gotta every one of your troops has to master zone reconnaissance.
Yeah.
Every one of your troops has to master route reconnaissance, and every one of them needs to be able to conduct a move and flank screen. Right. So because you never know which troop you're going to have to put into the threefold, and then who's the other two conducting a move and flank screen. That becomes the driver. Right. So a lot of brigade combat teams out there go, hey, I'm going to focus on movement to contact, because that forces me to train all the necessary tactical tasks that will allow me to be successful in the attack or the defense. You could argue, but that's what I like about moving flank guard for a cavalry organization at the 05 level.
I think it goes without saying that when we talk about this and we talk about squadrons, aviation doesn't get a pass on this one. It's the same thing that applies to them as squadron commanders and troop commanders as well. And it's something, again, that brings us back to air-ground operations, to integration of aviation capabilities, both the manned and unmanned side of it, that aviation has sorely craved to get to, but due to modularity, sometimes we're not able to fight. It can't be stated enough, sir, that I think aviation's going to have to take a long, hard look, especially if we want to get back to the level of integration that we had when we were good old-fashioned div-cav with Kiowa warriors and our friends over on the ground side.
Yeah, you're gonna have to get low. You're gonna have to get fast. You're gonna have to get out of. Every time a pilot says air weapons team, you need to tase them, right? We got to get out of that mindset. Again, we've got to make a cognitive break with our experience, right? So the coin experience that we've all been through in the last 20 years. There's some real goodness that's come out of that. The Army today is a much better Army than it was 20 years ago. You walk around the Army, people know what it's like to be shot at. That's something you didn't have in the Army in 1989. Right? They knew how they were going to react when some loud explosion went off near them. Right? They knew their own capacity to operate in incredible fear. Right? That you can't train that. You can all this other stuff we can train, but to do so, we've got to get east of the Vistula and north of the Han. We've got to make this cognitive break with this Middle Eastern experience that we've got, greater Middle Eastern experience that we've got.
And I agree with the other thing that we would add is we don't want the old guys like us extrapolating all, saying 100% of what we used to do is the exact way to do it. There's operational environments different, the different capabilities we bring to bear. So I think we are familiar with the principles, but our experience executing those things at the company troop battery level one OE is very different.
And I think we've got to be careful. We're not talking about going back.
Exactly.
Right? We're not going back. We're
Right.
going forward. We're going to reestablish some echelons that we haven't had
Right.
in a small period of time. But those formations are going to be better, different, more lethal, more capable. Right? And we need leaders and soldiers to man those formations that are better, more lethal, more capable. It's not going back.
Well, and it's important to say that, sir, because, it kind of makes us bat guano crazy at times that people say, well, the Army, whoever the Army is, the Army wants to go back to doing something it was more comfortable with. Well, the people that say that aren't familiar with the Army, because the Army was actually very comfortable with what we've been doing since 2003, 2004, because everybody had been doing it. So to say we weren't comfortable with it is untrue. The reason why we need to change and move forward is the world has changed, and the things that the nation is likely to ask the Army to do are different. And that's very different than this false narrative of we just want to go back to the old days because it was simpler. There was nothing simpler about it.
First off, it's a misimagination of what the old days were.
Absolutely.
Right. I love this narrative, and Nate, you're much more of a historian than anybody in the room, but you may disagree with this. But I think this narrative that we have, that the Army turned its back on counterinsurgency operations with, coming off the building in Saigon in 1975, I think is wrong. Right? We stand up JRTC first at Fort Chaffee, all designed as a light environment, a counterinsurgency environment. Right? We published the counter-guerrilla manual in 1986. Right? That's 11 years after coming out of Vietnam. It's 13 years after the end of combat operations in Vietnam, and it's It's an amalgamation of lessons of Vietnam and the lessons of Central and South America. Right? So we never turned our back on it. I mean, we had an entire training structure designed to help us get at it. We built units that were not going to be very effective in the Fulda Gap because we knew we were going to fight in other areas of the world, and those fights would be very, very different. It's the same today. We need to refocus our training effort to get away from the training demands, the moral responsibility to prepare soldiers for the combat that we were already planning to send them to do. That you couldn't just train high-intensity conflict and then send guys off to Iraq in 2011 and look yourself in the eye, right? Because you weren't helping them, right? We've got to refocus the effort. So what I've said recently is, hey, the base document for our doctrine needs to be large-scale combat operations focused. The annexes need to continue upgrading what we've learned over the past 20 years, right? But they've still got to be there. We can't unlearn those lessons. We've got to keep them and periodically train to them when we've mastered the skill sets that we need for the more existential problem we're seeing.
Right, because the Army's, it's a continuously evolving organization, so that experience at some point is going to be gone. But we preserve the experience in our doctrine, our training circulars, in our training strategies, and all of those things that are enduring, because those mission sets are still enduring. I mean, there's more than 100,000 folks out doing those kinds of missions every day. So we aren't walking away from it at all, from a doctrinal standpoint, from the training resource standpoint, or the training structure.
So, gentlemen, really quick, I have one last follow-up question, and I don't want to take too much of your time for it, but there has been a plethora of young folks out there talking about both the golden years of division cavalry and old cavalry.
I wouldn't use plethora. I'd use veritable cornucopia.
So, who have been some of the individuals, and what have been some of the articles that you guys have seen recently, and where should we turn some of our audience over to so that they can continue this discussion? Because it's, as a doctrine writer, I'm skimming quite a bit from some of my peers, especially guys like Nate and Amos Fox. But there's also other folks out there that are doing some great work. Can you illuminate some of the names and some of the ideas that are coming forward? What Nate Jennings and Amos Fox have been writing, they're probably two of the guys thinking most clear-eyed about the formations, the doctrine, and the problems that we face, specifically in this cavalry reconnaissance and security piece, but also just more broadly about warfare. I would also tell you that maybe not specific individuals, but I think we need to look what the Australians are talking about, right? So there's some great sites out there on social media, right? So Grounded Curiosity out of Australia, the Wavell Room out of the UK. I mean, there's some good sites where there's an awful lot of real good professional dialogue occurring, and I will tell you, I think the other thing that this generation benefits from more than my generation did at a minimum is we'd wait every 2 months for the next Armor Magazine or Infantry Journal to come out, or every quarter for Military Review to come out, and then we'd read those 10 articles and then we'd go on. I mean, those rich discussions are occurring every day today, right? And you're seeing it on all of this on the interweb, right? And then you can use the Google and go find a bunch of that. But social media is more than cat pictures, right? It's more than General Martin's dog Mandu, right? There's a whole bunch of sites out there that are really sharing some great discussions about what are going on. I live in the house at Fort Benning that Major General Farnsworth lived in. He was the first general officer to live in that house. He's also the general officer that gave Dwight D. Eisenhower a letter of reprimand for writing an article about the tank infantry team coming out of the First World War. Right? So that's 1919. So I'm constantly reminded when I look at his picture as I walk out my door, don't be that guy, right? And so the people who are going to solve the tactical and operational problems that we see today as the Army are
our majors and captains, right? And sergeant majors and master sergeants that are out there right now wrestling with these problem sets, and we got to encourage them. And there's an incredible rich dialogue occurring that we should participate in and encourage.
I just wanted to add one thing. So this, as we'll say, a Parthian shot. This DevCap thing is timely, not just filling an Army gap, but this is a joint gap. And as I was listening to you mentioned drones and some of the unmanned stuff. That's actually stuff that every service has. Everyone has drones. Everyone can access high altitude eyeballs. No one else can do forceful and durable recon on the ground. And now the Marines have ceded that ground, right? That the Army has is alone in providing this to a JTF or some other a COCOM or something. So this is wonderful that it's being pursued. A joint context is the real value.
Well, gentlemen, I think we've barely scratched the surface on cavalry missions, organizations, and also our future as cavalry soldiers. But I think it generates some genuinely awesome maneuver space for us to talk and write about combined arms cavalry and where it goes from here. And I can't thank you all enough for joining us on this discussion today.
Well, Nikki and Nate, thanks. First off, thanks for what you guys are doing, right? And thanks for having us, right? And any opportunity you get to sit with a national treasure is time well spent. Thanks.
Hey, so we really appreciate you taking the time to come up here and give us the no kidding what's going on down at Fort Benning and with the future of our cavalry organization. So thanks a lot for spending that.
Well, I'll tell you, you're always welcome to come to Fort Benning, right? I mean, that's where the Army does its difficult thinking about brigade and below warfighting.
Yes, sir.
We talk about the close combat force and how everything we just talked about is all about getting the tank infantry team into close combat to devastate a foe, seize its terrain, destroy its force, and control its population. Pose our wheel.
When we get down there, perhaps we can work a podcast on how battle captains in the Balkans sorted out the complexities of peace enforcement operations. I know you have some experience in that regard.
That'd be awesome. I'd love to tell you a story about how I used to screw with the Ready First Brigade from Black Hawk, Maine.
Yeah, Roger. I remember those days. All right, sir, thanks.
If you like what you heard, please put your trigger fingers to work and smash that subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform to get new episodes of Breaking Doctrine automatically. Major General Patrick Donahoe is a pretty regular user of Twitter, and you can follow him at Pat Donahoe at Army. While you're at it, you can also follow us at U.S. Army Doctrine. Finally, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Army, the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, or the Combined Arms Center. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Nikki Dean, and this has been Breaking Doctrine.